Hey everyone, today I thought we'd rank power designs, and how well they work within current DBD. Basically how fun, engaging, and generally fair different characters' powers are. This video was kind of triggered by the two most recent additions to the roster and their questionable powers. 6 tiers for this one. Let's get into it. Starting out with the bad power designs. The worst design killer for me is actually Clown. I really think his power is just so poorly conceived, to be honest. I think any power that causes survivors to slow down and have literally no recourse just straight isn't fun. Stack that with blurred vision and forced slow vaults, and it's just not great. The yellow bottles are just very plain and often useless, to put it simply. Bubba is our next character, and I think another badly conceived design. I think for this one they maybe tried to be a bit too loyal to his character, with things like the tantrum mechanic just so often being way too punishing. The sweep of the chainsaw is very basic, and just so uninteresting, particularly after Billy, whose power is far more dynamic and interesting to face. That's it for the bad designs for me. We're now moving on to poor power designs. Skull Merchant is getting a lot of comments about her power being really badly designed, and forcing 3-gen strategies, and generally boring gameplay. I do think it's a little more engaging than some other characters, but I do agree it's definitely not the best power we've gotten, feeling kind of convoluted and often giving you a lack of options when facing her. Knight is kind of a similar deal to Skull Merchant. I think I just prefer this a bit more because I think it's at least a very different type of gameplay, having multiple characters on the map, with the 3 guards having different effects and abilities too. Still a similar situation to Skull Merchant. Spirit is a character that to this day I just don't really get. The fact there's a character that for a long time could go invisible and there was no way to tell where she was at all seems crazy to me. With the changes and being able to hear her, it's definitely better, and would have been the worst design I feel if she had stayed without that sound cue. Hag, I think, is a fairly poor design, largely because it just encourages camping and it feels often almost punishing not to camp or set up a close area. Her power thrives off of entrapping people into small areas, and that just doesn't feel the best for DBD's overall gameplay, where ideally you want some freedom on both sides. Legion I do think have a poor power design, and it's mainly because of its centering around mending, which is so boring. A largely unavoidable forced 12-second healing animation that stops you from doing actions just isn't fun. With the added 5-hit insta-down mechanic, it's a little better I feel, but Legion has always been kind of let down by the mend part of their power. Moving right along to the average power designs. These are ones I feel pretty indifferent on. Trickster for me has not the best design, and it's largely because facing it feels very unfair a lot of the time, and just feels like there's not much to be done to counter it. You just get barraged and you have to hope there's enough stuff in the way to survive. I also think he isn't helped by the fact that he's up alongside much more well-designed ranged characters like Slinger and Huntress. Maybe he wouldn't seem so average if it weren't for them. Freddy is pretty average for me because he's just very dull. The design itself isn't bad necessarily, it's just really boring. Place 5 anti-loop traps that slow survivors so you can catch them while chasing them on loops. That's the power. The dream world is nice and definitely a cool mechanic, particularly with the new textures and lullaby radius, but it feels like there should have been a madness type deal for the dream world, with more fake things and more caution needed. Nurse is average for me because although she breaks the game, she's also the only character who does. And I think this aspect makes her pretty acceptable within the wider roster. Her power is a good design, I think, just not for this game. That's kind of a contradiction, but I'm not sure how to explain it really. Trapper I think definitely suffers from being one of the earlier characters, and I do think nowadays he doesn't fit the current game all too well. He often feels very punishing to play, with frustrating mechanics like needing to pick up traps that spawn randomly. It takes time to then set them that you often don't have, and the fact that traps can be so easily countered. It also doesn't feel great as a survivor when you step in one. I personally don't find Trapper that great feeling for either side. Time now for good power designs. I like these ones. Dredge's power has always just been very bizarre to me, with it being such a strange mix of different things. I think there's a lot of good ideas, but I don't think it's particularly cohesive. Nightfall I think is a cool mechanic, and the way you build it feels pretty balanced and fair. The Remnants and their counterplay is also good I think, although a little boring sometimes. It's mainly the locker teleports I don't like. I feel tying movement to lockers is just kind of bizarre, with maps varying so much on locker placements. Artist I appreciate mainly because of the potential she has to damage from anywhere on the map. I think that's really cool, and her method of doing so is actually extremely fair. This is evened out by the less fair feeling close loop chases, and the not so great feeling of counterplay often being to leave a loop or get hit. Nemesis is a little like Dredge. He has kind of a weird addition with the zombies. I do think his core power is very good though. The only part I really don't like is how it can feel very unfair or punishing, as it can often force you to suffer hits, regardless of if you decide to vault or not to vault. The scaling power with the mutation is nice. I do think I'd prefer it though if the difference between different tiers was more defined. Pig I think has one of the cooler combinations with her kit. It's just a shame it's not that effective really. Reverse bear traps are a great inbuilt slowdown and feel mostly fun to use and face, being quite intense. The only factor is the not great feeling of it taking ages to get off, or when pigs decide to try and force a head pop. Her ambush and crouch is great, it's just really weak and not all too effective for the current pace of DBD's gameplay. Wraith is simple, but I think his power is well designed. Maybe aside Lightburn, which feels like a needlessly punishing mechanic that rewards survivors greatly for using a flashlight. Otherwise, speed when cloaked, uncloak with an indicator, and speed after doing so. It works well I think. I do think he could use another thing to add on, but I think the design of his power has always been good. Sadako I think is well designed, aside the condemned mechanic, which feels very inconsistent, and just doesn't scale well I guess throughout the match. Her teleports and manifestation mechanics feel fun for me though, and I find facing them quite engaging, particularly with the way she flickers and the more dynamic kind of stealth power she has. Shape is pretty well designed I think. He works great in terms of being faithful to his film self, but gameplay wise he definitely isn't as perfect. There are definite flaws with how the stalking works and how rewarding it feels as a mechanic, particularly with certain restrictions like it capping out at certain points, and it not feeling great as a survivor if you weren't stalked much, only to get insta-down. Billy's power design I think was maybe one of the better ones originally, before things like overheat were introduced, and he was generally made a lot more punishing to play, in part because of new map additions. Billy's power is rewarding, but it's also quite punishing for the person playing with it. Before it would maybe be top tier, but nowadays I think it's around here. Great power designs are up next. Twins I do believe have a great design, just in their current spot they are really let down by how horribly janky they are. I do love the way you can pick between essentially two different killers within the same trial, each with different abilities and ways to be played, and you can also use them together with some cohesion between them. Really cool idea, and executed well I do think, just requiring some tune-ups and a bit of love. Cenobite is another character that may be a bit of a surprise to see so high, but I really like his power design. It's unique and fun I find, and I just enjoy the gameplay loop that the box introduces. The only aspect that's a little iffy is the RNG spawn of the box, but even that can be predicted to some success. His chain shot is also a difficult but rewarding anti-loop or slowdown tool, which pairs up well with the box and the chain hunt. Huntress falls into the simple but effective category. She's basically M1 killer, but she can throw the M1s, evened out by the slower movement, the wind-up time, and the need to reload at lockers. The locker spawn reliance is maybe the only weakness about the power, that and it's maybe a little too simple. Ghostface I think has a really great design, just it's still an issue with his reveal being a bit weird. The concept of sneaking around and leaning, revealing for a timed insta-down, I think is a lot of fun though, and makes for tense and engaging gameplay that feels fair, but can also be strong if used correctly. Deathslinger for me is the best designed ranged character. His weapon requires skill and precision, it's restricted by its one shot before requiring a reload, and it doesn't rely on surrounding RNG spawns like Huntress. Simple power, but I think very fair to both play and counter, the only downside being the lack of ability to traverse and hold the map. Doctor, I think, is a very well designed character, with fair and balanced abilities that feel mostly fun to interact with. The gradual progression of madness through shocks is interesting, and it's nice how the hallucinations can be adjusted with different add-ons and such. The ability to time shocks correctly to stop actions is also a very interesting mechanic, I think. Finally, we have arrived at the amazing power designs. These are the best out of the roster. Demogorgon has one of the simpler powers, but also one of the best designs, I think. It's basically just a longer, faster basic attack, with visual cues and stuff to help counter. Portals are a fair mechanic for moving across the map, and are effective enough without being overly oppressive. Executioner I still feel is one of the better power designs, and largely because of the options he provides for both sides. His ranged attack is fair and has indicators of usage, his trails are avoidable and not overly oppressive, his cages make for interesting, adjusted gameplay without changing it too much, overall just different, but very fair still for both sides, I think. Blight, as much as I really am not a fan of his power, mainly because of different techs I don't personally like, I do think it was designed well. It really encourages fun and much more dynamic chases, where you get a lot of different options for how to react to one another, and what you can do when playing. Plague is another character that's really up there for me. I love the trade-off or toss-up between infection or giving Plague her power, when survivors are given the option to cleanse. Her gameplay maybe feels the most balanced for that reason. I know many find the sickness a bit of a bore, and I agree in some ways, as I do think the fact it disregards healing perks is a fairly big thing, with them being a big part of the game. So it isn't the best. Then again, current healing is maybe one of the least fun and balanced things currently. So hey, Oni's power design I think is basically a better version of Maya's power, more streamlined to DBD in its gameplay. The requirement for getting the power is much more direct, and allows pressure to be applied whilst building it, and the power itself is a bit more dynamic, and allows for some fun interactions, similar to Billy and Blight. Wesker was a character I felt very strange about early into his edition, but I think I may agree with lots of people's thoughts on this, that it may be the game's best designed power. A fun chase power with built-in slowdown that is effective, but also not too punishing or frustrating to deal with. Alright, well that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Drop your own rankings down below. Thanks, and goodbye.